Hi guys, welcome back. Okay, we are on chapter 13, or Introducing Mr. Harry, which I promise is the name of the chapter, Mr. Harry. So remember, that guy is hanging in the tree with their food pack. So I'm assuming that the bear is Mr. Harry. I knew it, I shouted triumphantly. I knew someone was stealing our food. Crookston and Jehu were staring up at the tree with stunned expressions. They had come running when I screamed, their hair mussed from sleep, and Jehu was carrying a burning log from the campfire. And it looks like that someone is up in the tree, Jehu observed dryly. Should I shoot him? Don't shoot, the voice in the tree begged huskily. Jehu stepped forward and sighed. Come on down, or I can't be responsible for her shooting you.
Wow, Mom, that was cool.
Yeah. My pack fell to the ground, and a moment later, the man followed it with a crash. Oof, he groaned as he struck the ground. The man stood up, and the light from Jehu's torch illuminated the strange, bulky figure. He was wearing some sort of cape-like covering made of various animal skins, and a wretched smell emanated from it. And you thought I smelled bad? I asked, taking a step back. Skunk gotcha, eh, gal? The man cackled. Crookston's eyes narrowed in recognition. Harry Bill, he said in a flat voice. Pleased to meet you, ma'am, Harry Bill said, bowing low. Yeah, the man who was kicked off of Shoalwater Bay, I asked. Crookston nodded. For stealing. I didn't steal nothing, that's a lie, Harry Bill declared in an indignant voice. You took our molasses, I pointed out. And salmon, Crookston added. Okay, babe, let's put this over here and put it on the floor. Sorry. Okay. Harry Bill bit his lip. The molasses, if you please, I said, putting my hand out. He reached into his cape, a little reluctantly, and then pulled out the jar and handed it to me. It was half empty, and the entire jar was sticky and covered with bits of fur and fluff. Did you use your fingers? I demanded, eyeing his filthy hands. He shrugged. Ain't got no spoon. I shook my head in disgust and jerked the jar back. You can keep it. Harry Bill snatched it quickly and squirreled it away in his voluminous cape. Thank you, ma'am. I heard you were a nice lady. Why are you following us? Don't you have a home to go to? My wife kicked me out, he said in a small, sad voice. I was quite certain she had very good reason, considering the poor character of the man. Where is she? Richmond, Virginia. I gave him a long look. Really? We needed to get rid of this man, or we would starve to death. Mr. Harry, I said finally, I do believe if you took the time to clean yourself up and apologize, she would quite likely take you back. You really think she'd take me back? He asked, hope shining in his eyes. I certainly wouldn't, but at least it would get him to the other side of the country. I'm sure she would consider it, especially if you took my advice about the bath. He scratched his head and then beamed at me as if he found the notion appealing. Why, ma'am, that's a mighty fine idea. I believe I will go home and apologize. In fact, I believe I'll get moving right after I have some victuals. He looked at me beseechingly. A man can't walk on an empty stomach. Jehu snorted. But you've been stealing our food for days, I said. I was not at all inclined to cook for this man. Jane, Jehu said, sounding tired, just give him something to eat. Yeah, the least you can do is feed me, Harry Bill whined. Crookston snatched the rifle out of my hands and pointed the gun straight at Harry Bill. Eat and then go. Harry Bill held up his hands. I promise, you have my word. Word of thief, Crookston grumbled. By the time the sun was creeping up over the horizon, so I cooked breakfast for all of us. As our supplies were somewhat lower because of Harry Bill's pilfering, I used the Indian meal to make Johnny cakes. Harry Bill inhaled every scrap I placed in front of him. That was mighty tasty, ma'am, Harry Bill said, wiping his mouth with what appeared to be a foxtail dangling from the cape. That is a rather unusual cape you have there, I observed. Thanky, he said, looking pleased, and it's real warm, too. Not to mention it probably keeps the other animals away, Jehu added dryly. Harry Bill looked affronted. He tugged up his furry cape and said, I best be going now. Calypso nodded in agreement, fingering the rifle. And with that, Harry Bill got up and loped away, looking very much like the bear I had mistaken him for. Something occurred to me. Mr. Harry, I shouted. He paused, looking back over his furry shoulder. How long ago exactly did your wife kick you out? I reckon it's been about, 15 years now, give or take a few. 15 years, I said. I see. Well, good luck anyway. Harry Bill disappeared into the sunrise. Jehu shook his head. He's gonna need it. Yeah, sure, you're gonna show up 15 years later. There seemed little point in going back to bed, so we packed up and set out in the cool morning light. We should have checked his pockets, I said as we walked along. There was the distinct sound of crash behind us. "Oh dear," I said. "He's still following us, isn't he?" Caruxo weighted the rifle in his hands. "Not if he's smart," Jehu said. "Whatever gave you the impression that he was smart?" I asked. Jehu chuckled. We tromped along until we reached a creek. It was flooded, and water rushed down angrily. "No," Caruxo said with an audible groan. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Big tree for crossing. It is gone," Caruxo said, pointing. A long, thick tree lay in the creek, partially submerged in the deep water. "That was the only way across?" Jehu asked, scratching his head. "Fastest way," Caruxo said. I surveyed the creek. Another tree, a slender one, had fallen across, forming a natural bridge. "What about that tree?" I suggested. Jehu said doubtfully, "I don't think it will hold us. If we could just get across somehow and rig a rope," his voice trailed off. Caruxo was shaking his head. "Mr. Russell," he said hollowly. Something about the expression on Caruxo's face shook me, and I suddenly knew what I had to do. I went over to Jehu's pack and took out the bundle of rope. Using the sailor's knot Jehu had taught me, I tied one end around my waist and the other end around the trunk of a thick, sturdy tree. Then I walked to the edge of the creek where the slender tree bridge awaited me. "Jane, what are you doing?" Jehu asked. "I'm going across. I'm light enough. When I get to the other side, I'll tie the rope on that tree over there, and then you can come across using that. After all, you showed me how to tie that knot," I said, trying to put on a brave face. "You can't be serious. What if you fall?" I patted the rope around my waist and swallowed hard. "Then you drag me up." And with that, I took a tentative step onto the bridge. "Jane, no!" Jehu shouted, moving quickly toward me. "You're scared of heights and—" But his voice was fading, and I just looked forward, walking slowly, foot after foot. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the middle of the bridge. For a moment, I wavered. The wind seemed to whip up. I felt the wood bow beneath my weight, and fear crackled through me like lightning. "Jane!" Jehu said in a strangled voice. I stood there, paralyzed. I blinked when I opened my eyes. I was standing on a rooftop in Philadelphia, and Jebediah Parker was right there beside me. "Come on, Jane, it's easy," he called gaily. He scampered ahead of me along the high rooftop, his feet sure, his arms wide. I blinked again, and he was gone, and I was standing over the raging water. But it didn't matter, because I knew I could do it. After all, I had been beset by tragedy after tragedy. William Balt had abandoned me, and my father had died, but I was still here, and I was strong. Most of all, I remembered that I, Jane Peck, was the best spitter in all of Philadelphia. I looked down into all that rushing water and spit. When I looked back at Jehu, his face had gone white, but I just winked and walked to the other side. Jehu's eyes were shining when he finally made it over. "I knew you had it in you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He gripped my shoulders hard as if he were afraid I would disappear. My heart was full to bursting. "See, I really was the best spitter in all of Philadelphia." "Among other things," he said, his body moving closer to mine. "Like what?" I asked, transfixed by the way one thick, dark curl hung over his forehead. He traced his finger along my nose. "I'll bet you were the prettiest girl in all of Philadelphia." "Maybe," I gulped. "And I'm sure you had the best manners." "Possibly." His finger touched my chin gently, tilting it up, and I stared into his blue eyes, waiting. "Oh, Jane," he whispered, and then he pulled me into his chest and hugged me hard, his hand smoothing my hair. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady thumping of his heart, and smiled. I knew they still liked each other. The day grew colder, frosty even, but Jehu's warm smile and firm hand clasping mine kept me toasty straight through. Soon, though, even Jehu's attentions could not stop my feet from becoming numb with cold. By the time the sun was falling, I was frozen straight through and tripping from the sheer lack of feeling in my feet. Even Jehu and Caruxo were feeling the effects of the cold weather. Jehu's lips were tinged with blue. Jehu dumped the packs and pushed me gently down in the pile. "Wait here," he said, and he and Caruxo disappeared. I reached into a pack and pulled a blanket around me, a dizzy exhaustion stealing over my body. My eyes fluttered shut. All I wanted was to be back home in Philadelphia, sitting in our warm parlor on Walnut Street. I believe I would have given anything for a bath and a proper bed and a slice of Mrs. Parker's cherry pie. And then suddenly, I could feel the heat of a crackling fire. I opened my eyes, hardly believing, and there was Papa sitting in his chair, smoking his pipe, his cheeks flushed with good health. The smoke seemed to linger in the air, hovering on the edge of my senses. Papa shook my shoulders gently, concern in his eyes. "Are you okay, Janie?" He was shaking me hard, but when I blinked, there was Jehu. "Are you okay, Jane?" he asked urgently. I swallowed hard, looking around for Papa in confusion. It was dark now. I was sitting on the cold ground, a blanket and some packs around me. I looked up at him and nodded mutely. Let's go then, he said, helping me up. We found a good place to camp for the night. The good place they found was a dank, dirty cave. It smelled awful, as if some animal had lived in it, which was probably the truth. The ceiling was so low I couldn't stand properly, and roots dangled and poked into my hair. It was perfectly dreadful. This is actually worse than Mr. Russell's cabin, I said despondently, crouching down on the ground. I never thought I'd see the day that I'd longed for that place. Caruso thinks there's a storm brewing, and so do I. And we don't want to get caught without shelter, Jehu said firmly. What if this is a grizzly bear's cave, I asked. What if the bear is out hunting and comes back and finds us here? Caruso shook his head firmly. Not bear cave, too small. Oh, good, that's a relief, I said, slumping against the cold wall. Wolf cave, he clarified, holding up what appeared to be the bones of a small animal, no doubt the wolf's most recent supper. I threw my hands up. Oh, lovely, wolf, I said sarcastically. Let us handle things, Jehu said soothingly. And handle things they did. Jehu kindled a fire, which promptly went out when the wind whipped through the cave. He kindled it again, and the wind snuffed it again. After the fire went out the third time, I suggested that they hang one of the blankets across the entrance, leaving a small hole for the smoke to escape. Finally, the fire caught for good, and the cave began to warm up a bit. We had an uninspired supper, dried venison and more camas, and after that, the men promptly fell asleep. Useless men. How could they sleep when there was a wolf lurking outside the cave? I sidled over to Jehu. Wake up, I whispered, nudging him. What? He growled, one eye open in a squint. What if the wolf comes back? What if it comes in back and eats us? Jehu flipped on his side and cuddled up to his pack, flinging his arm over it. Don't worry, Jane. You smell too bad for any wolf to want to eat you. I couldn't believe him. They were quite happy to sleep, while some wolf was out there waiting to get back in its den. Hold on, sweetheart. I'm almost done.
I lost cat.
I'll find him. 1 second. Well, I, for one, had no intention of being eaten by a wolf. I hauled McCarty's rifle to my side and propped it against a wall, determined to stay awake. I stared doggedly at the entrance of the cave. The sound of the wind seemed to sing outside, lulling me, dragging me down to where it was so peaceful and warm, and... I woke abruptly, shaking my head. I had just nodded off for a moment, hadn't I? The air hummed with the soft snores of Jehu and Caruso. A thin shaft of gray light streamed in through the corner of the blanket at the mouth of the cave, and I struggled to my feet, rifle in hand. I opened the blanket and blinked. Clean white snow stretched out in all directions, and it was still falling. We were snowed in. It's one problem after another. All right, I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining.